The grand atrium of the royal palace blazed with light from 1,000 floating crystals. Nobles filled the ceremonial chamber in their finest robes of silver and midnight blue, and they watched as Prince Kareth ascended the steps toward the crystal. Throne Queen Mathera stood to one side in chains of woven light that bound her wrists and ankles. She looked diminished and defeated, and every noble present believed they were witnessing the end of an era. Princess Sarai stood beside her mother with similar restraints, and her eyes were red from tears. She refused to let fall. Guards lined every wall and entrance with weapons drawn and faces hidden behind ceremonial masks. Prince Kareth reached the top of the steps and turned to face the assembled court. "My people," he announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. "Today I accept the burden of leadership that my mother has proven unworthy to bear." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Evidence has been found of conspiracy against the throne. Kareth continued, "My mother and sister plotted to undermine the succession and weaken our great sovereignty." He gestured, and guards stepped forward to flank the two prisoners. "The punishment for treason is death," the prince declared, "and it shall be carried out immediately following my coronation." The nobles shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke in opposition. This was how things worked in voluntary politics. The strong eliminated the weak, and everyone pretended it was justice. Kareth reached for the crown that rested on a pedestal beside the throne. His fingers had just brushed the crystal circlet when the lights went out. Darkness crashed over the chamber like a wave, and screams erupted from nobles who suddenly found themselves blind. Voluntary eyes were adapted for the eternal twilight of their homeworld, and they could not adjust to complete absence of light. But human eyes were different. Yun had spent 6 weeks studying the palace systems and learning exactly where every power conduit ran. He had spent 3 days memorizing the positions of every guard and calculating their response times. He moved through the darkness like a ghost. The first guard died without knowing what killed him. The second managed to raise his weapon before Doyen's blade found his throat. Screaming filled the chamber as nobles trampled each other trying to flee. Doyen ignored them and focused on the guards surrounding the prisoners. He had studied voluntary physiology and knew exactly where their vital points were located. He had learned their fighting styles and identified their weaknesses. Most importantly, he had learned that they did not expect anyone to keep fighting after taking wounds that should be crippling. A guard slashed him across the arm, and Doyen barely noticed. Another drove a blade into his side, and he used the momentum to get inside the guard's reach and break his neck. Pain was just information, and information could be processed later. The emergency lighting flickered on and bathed the chamber in dim red illumination. Nobles stopped running and stared at the scene before them. Bodies of royal guards lay scattered across the floor, and standing in the middle of them was a single human covered in violet and red blood. Doyen walked toward the steps where Prince Kareth stood frozen with the crown still in his hands. "You," the prince breathed. "Me," Doyen agreed. Kareth drew his ceremonial blade and pointed it at the approaching human. "Guards," he shouted, "kill this creature." The remaining guards hesitated. They looked at the bodies of their comrades and at the human, who should not be standing, let alone walking. They looked at the blood dripping from wounds that would have dropped any. Valentarathi did not move. "Your guards are learning something important," Dion said as he climbed the steps. "They are learning what happens when humans have something worth fighting for." Kareth backed toward the throne. "Stay away from me," he commanded. "I am the crown prince, and you are nothing but a primitive animal." Doyen stopped 3 steps below the prince. "You tried to kill your sister," he said. "Twice that I know of, and probably more times that I do not. She was a complication." Kareth snarled. "Her death would have simplified the succession. You are admitting to attempted murder of royal blood," Diane said loudly enough for the entire chamber to hear. In front of the entire court, the nobles exchanged glances. Prince Kareth had just confessed to violating one of the oldest laws of the sovereignty. "It does not matter," Kareth said desperately. "I am the heir and my word is law." "Not yet," a voice called out. Queen Mathera stood tall despite her chains, and her eyes blazed with fierce light. "You have not completed the coronation," she said, "and until you do, I am still the ruler of this sovereignty." The light restraints around her wrists flickered and dissolved. She had been faking weakness the entire time. "Guards," she commanded, "arrest my son for treason against the crown." The guards who had refused to attack Diane moved immediately to obey. They understood where power actually resided in this moment. Kareth's face twisted with rage, and he lunged at Doyen with his blade raised. It was a mistake. Doyen caught the prince's wrist and twisted until bone cracked, and the blade fell. He drove his fist into Kareth's solar plexus and felt ribs give way under the impact. The prince collapsed, gasping and choking, and Diane stood over him without mercy. "You spent your whole life believing that strength comes from cruelty," Diane said quietly. "You never understood that real strength comes from having something worth dying for." Kareth looked up at him with hatred burning in his eyes. "What could you possibly have worth dying for?" He spat. Doyen glanced at Sarai, who stood free now, with tears streaming down her face. "Her," he said simply. The guards dragged Kareth away, and Queen Mathera addressed the assembled nobles with authority that silenced all whispers. "My son has confessed to attempted murder of royal blood," she declared. "He is stripped of his position and will face judgment according to our oldest laws." She paused, and her gaze swept across the chamber. "I name Princess Sarai Telvaneth as my heir," she announced. "Any who object may speak now." No one spoke. The nobles looked at the human standing on the steps, covered in blood and wounds that should have killed him 3 times over. They looked at his eyes that held no fear and no mercy. No one objected. 6 months later, Queen Mathera passed peacefully in her sleep with her daughter at her side. Princess Sarai became Queen Sarai, and the voluntary sovereignty entered a new era. She implemented reforms that her mother had dreamed of for centuries, and she opened relations with species that the Voluntari had dismissed as inferior, including humans. Doyen remained at her side through all of it, not as a guardian because she had plenty of those now. Court did not have a word for what he was to her. The closest translation was something like trusted companion, or perhaps chosen family. Humans had a simpler word for it: friend. Other species across the galaxy watched what had happened and took note. A human had thrown himself in front of a blade for a stranger. A human had stood against an empire because it was the right thing to do. A human had bled and suffered and refused to fall because someone needed him. Perhaps the primitives from Earth deserved a second look. Perhaps there was something special about a species that would die for love and fight for justice and never stop, no matter how badly they were hurt. Perhaps humanity had something to teach the galaxy. After all, Doyen stood on a balcony overlooking the crystal spires of the palace as dawn painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Sarai joined him, and they watched the sunrise together in comfortable silence. "Thank you," she said eventually. "For what?" he asked. "For being human," she said. He smiled, and for the first time in a very long while it felt genuine. "Anytime," he said. They stood together as the new day began, and somewhere among the stars, other species looked toward Earth with new eyes. The age of humanity was just beginning, and the galaxy would never be the same. Queen Mathera spoke for 3 hours in her chamber of shadows, and every word landed like a stone in still water. Voluntary sovereignty was dying, not from war or disease or economic collapse, but from something far more insidious. Tradition had calcified into dogma, and dogma had strangled innovation and progress, until the once great civilization had become a beautiful corpse pretending to live. "We were the masters of this galaxy before your species learned to walk upright," the queen said. We built empires that spanned 1,000 worlds, and our technology was the envy of every civilization. She paused, and her ancient eyes grew distant. And then we stopped. She continued, "We decided that we had achieved perfection. And that change was unnecessary, and slowly we began to rot from the inside." Diane listened without interrupting. "My son will accelerate that rot," she said. "Kareth believes that strength comes from domination, and he will drag us into wars we cannot win against species who have not forgotten how to adapt." "And your daughter?" Diane asked. The Queen smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "Sarai is different," she said. "She questions traditions that others accept blindly, and she sees value in species that we have dismissed as inferior. You want her on the throne," Diane said. "I need her on the throne," the Queen corrected. "She is the only hope my people have for survival, and she does not even know it yet." Diane processed what he was hearing. "A people have for survival, and she does not even know it yet." Diane processed what he was hearing. Queen asking a human to help overthrow her own son and place her youngest daughter in power. It sounded insane, and it probably was. "Why me?" he asked. "You have advisors and generals and centuries of experience in political manipulation." The Queen's expression shifted to something that looked almost like grief. "Because I cannot trust any of them," she admitted. 10,000 years of backstabbing and betrayal have left me surrounded by people who calculate every action for personal advantage." She stepped closer, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "You saved my daughter without expecting reward," she said. "You killed for her without hesitation, and you have refused every opportunity to leverage your position for gain. That does not make me qualified to topple a government." Diane said. "No," the Queen agreed, "but it makes you the only person in this palace who might act from genuine loyalty rather than self-interest." She told him the rest of it then. How she had arranged for him to be assigned to that reception months ago, how she had known about the assassination plot and had let it proceed, how she had gambled that a human would react differently than her own guards when the blade came down. "You use your own daughter as bait," Diane said, and his voice carried an edge of cold fury. "I used the only tool available to me," the Queen replied without flinching. "I was right about you. He wanted to be angry, and part of him was she had manipulated him from the beginning. And Sarai had nearly died because of calculated royal scheming. But he also understood something that the Queen had not expected. She was desperate. Beneath all the power and tradition and ancient dignity was a mother watching her civilization crumble, while her children played games of murder. "What do you need me to do?" Diane asked. The Queen outlined her plan with precision that spoke of years of careful preparation. Diane would make contact with factions opposed to Prince Kareth and build alliances that the Queen could not be seen forming herself. He would be her hand in the shadows, reaching into places where royal eyes could not go without causing suspicion. "The succession ceremony is in 3 months, she said. "When Kareth formally accepts the position of crown heir, he will have the legal authority to remove anyone he considers a threat, including you and Sarai," Diane said. "Including us," she confirmed. "We must move before that ceremony, and we must have enough support to make our move stick." Diane spent the following weeks doing something that confused every Valanthari he encountered. He told the truth when he met with Lady Thesa, who commanded a significant military faction. He did not offer bribes or threats or complex political arrangements. He simply explained that Prince Kareth would destroy the sovereignty and asked if she wanted to help stop him. Lady Thesa stared at him for a long moment. "You are not trying to trap Emmy," she said slowly. "There is no hidden agenda behind your words." "No," Diane said. "Humans are very strange," she said, but she agreed to listen when he approached the Council of Merchants, who controlled much of the sovereignty's economic power. He did not make promises of favorable trade agreements or political positions. He told them that their civilization was dying and that they could either help change course or watch everything they had built crumble to dust. The council debated for hours and asked dozens of questions designed to uncover his true motives. They could not find any because he did not have any beyond what he had stated. Eventually, they agreed to provide quiet Supermencio watched these interactions with growing amazement. "You are building a coalition through sincerity," she said one evening in his quarters. "That should not work. Everyone in this palace has been lied to for so long that truth has become a foreign language." Diane replied, "When someone actually speaks it, they do not know how to respond. And when Prince Kareth discovers what you are doing," she asked, "then things will get complicated." He admitted he visited Sarai every day despite the growing danger of their association. She remained officially unaware of the conspiracy being built in her name, though Doyen suspected she understood. More than she revealed, they walked through gardens and talked about nothing important, and he found himself looking forward to those moments more than he should. "My mother speaks highly of you," Sarai said during one such walk. "She says you are unlike any being she has encountered in 3 centuries of rule." "I am just a soldier," Doyen said. "No," Sarai replied and stopped to face him directly. "You are something this court has not seen in 10,000 years. "What is that?" he asked. "Someone who does what is right because it is right," she said, "not because it brings advantage or avoids punishment, but simply because some things matter more than self-preservation." She reached out and touched the scar on his chest, where the assassin's blade had cut him. "You almost died for me," she said softly. "And you would do it again without hesitation." "Yes," Diane said. He did not know what else to say. The night before the succession ceremony, everything fell apart. Prince Kareth summoned the royal guard and declared that evidence of treason had been discovered. The Queen and Princess Sarai were placed under protective custody, which meant they were prisoners in everything. But Namdine was not in the palace when the order came. He was meeting with the final faction leaders needed to complete the coalition. By the time he learned what had happened, the trap had already closed. The prince moved faster than anticipated. Lady Thesa said grimly, "He will execute them tomorrow after he accepts the crown." "Then we move tonight," Doyen said. "We are not ready," she protested. "We need more time to coordinate." Doyen looked at the assembled faction leaders who had risked everything on his word. "Sarai and the Queen will be dead by tomorrow night," he said. "Ready or not, this ends now." He thought about the princess who had knelt in his blood and held his life in her hands. He thought about the promise he had made without words. No one else would die for her, not while he still breathed. "Tell your people to secure the outer palace," he said. "I will handle the rest." Lady Thesa stared at him. "You cannot fight through the royal guard alone," she said. Doyen smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Watch me," he said. 6 weeks on the Velanthari throne world had taught Dayun that alien politics made human power struggles look like children fighting over toys. The royal palace complex spread across an entire continent with towers of living crystal that grew from the earth and chambers carved from stone older than human civilization. Every hallway held potential danger, and every conversation carried hidden meanings beneath the surface. He walked 3 steps behind Princess Sarai as they moved through the Garden of Eternal Twilight, where bioluminescent flowers bloomed in shades of purple and blue. Velanthari nobles watched them pass with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open contempt. A human guardian for a royal princess was unprecedented and scandalous and endlessly fascinating to the court. "They are staring again," Sarai murmured without turning her head. "They never stop." Doyen replied. She laughed softly, and it was a sound he had grown to appreciate over the past weeks. The princess had a warmth that seemed absent in most of her species, and she treated him like a person rather than a curiosity or a tool. "My brother requested an audience with you," she said, and her voice carried a note of warning. "Prince Kareth Doyan asked, though he already knew the answer. He wishes to understand what manner of creature has attached itself to our family. Sarai said. Those were his exact words. Doyan had studied the prince extensively since arriving on the throne world. Kareth Talvaneth was the eldest son and heir apparent to the sovereignty. He was brilliant and ruthless, and viewed humans as useful animals at best. The prince also had a reputation for eliminating obstacles to his eventual reign through methods that were technically legal under voluntary tradition. I will meet with him, Doyan said. Be careful, Sarai warned. My brother sees everyone as either a tool to be used or a threat to be removed. They reached a pavilion at the center of the garden, where a human woman waited with data tablets clutched against her chest. Mincio was a diplomatic attaché assigned by the Union to help Doyan navigate voluntary culture. She was young and sharp and entirely out of her depth in the snake pit of royal politics. Sergeant Park, she said with obvious relief. I have updates from Commander Cho. Doyan nodded to Sarai, who understood the dismissal and moved away to examine a cluster of glowing flowers. What news? He asked quietly. The Union is officially protesting your detention, Mincio said, but privately they are delighted to have a human embedded in the voluntary royal court. So I am a spy now, Doyan said flatly. An observer, Mincio corrected. There is a difference according to the diplomats. He doubted the voluntary would appreciate that distinction. What else? The asked. Mincio hesitated and glanced around to make sure no one was close enough to hear. Intelligence suggests the assassination attempt on Princess Sarai was ordered by someone inside the palace, she said. Someone with enough power to access molecular blades and bypass security protocols. Doyan had suspected as much. Prince Kareth, he said. Mincio's eyes widened. That is a serious accusation, she whispered. It is a logical conclusion, he replied. The princess is politically insignificant, which means her death would have been a minor inconvenience to most factions, but removing her eliminates a potential complication for the succession. You think the prince tried to murder his own sister? Mincio asked. I think voluntary politics makes fratricide look like a hobby, Doyan said. He left Mincio in the pavilion and returned to Sarai, who had wandered deeper into the garden. She stood before a fountain where water flowed upward in defiance of gravity, and her expression was distant and troubled. You know, Doyan said quietly as he approached. She did not pretend to misunderstand. I have known since I was old enough to understand how my family operates, she said without turning around. Kareth sees me as a loose thread, and eventually he will cut me away. And you accept that? Doyan asked. She finally looked at him, and her eyes held a sadness that seemed ancient despite her relative youth. What choice do I have? She asked. I am the third daughter with no power and no allies, and speaking against the heir would mean immediate execution for treason. Anger stirred in Doyan's chest, and he forced it down. Where I come from, we do not accept murder as a normal part of family life, he said. Your species is very strange, Sarai replied with a ghost of a smile. 3 days later, Doyan met with Prince Kareth in a private chamber high in the central tower. The prince was tall, even by voluntary standards, with skin that shimmered in cold shades of blue and silver, and eyes that calculated value and threat with every glance. The human guardian, Kareth said with amusement. I wanted to see what manner of creature convinced my mother to break 10,000 years of tradition. Doyan stood at attention and said nothing. You may speak freely, the prince said. I am curious about your kind. What would you like to know? Doyan asked carefully. Why did you save my sister? Kareth asked. The truth now and not the noble nonsense you fed my mother. Doyan considered his answer. Lying to the prince seemed pointless, since voluntary were reportedly skilled at detecting deception. Because she was in danger, and I could help, he said. Kareth studied him for a long moment. Remarkable, he said finally. You actually believe that is sufficient reason? It is sufficient for me, Doyan replied. The prince rose from his seat and walked a slow circle around Doyan like a predator examining prey. Humans are fascinating creatures, he mused. So primitive and yet so unpredictable, and your species accomplishes things that make no logical sense. We have our moments, Diane said. Indeed. Kara stopped directly in front of him. My sister is fond of you, and that is unfortunate. Because fondness creates vulnerability, and vulnerability invites tragedy. The threat was barely veiled. I understand. Doyan said. I doubt that. The prince replied. But you will learn. 1 week later, assassins came for Sarai during a ceremonial hunt in the crystal forests outside the palace. 3 of them emerged from the trees with blades drawn and faces hidden. Behind masks, Doyan killed the first one before the assassin could take 2 steps. Broke the neck of the second with a technique that the Voluntari guards watching from a distance would later describe as horrifyingly efficient. The third managed to cut him across the ribs before Diane drove a blade through his throat. He stood over the bodies covered in violet Voluntari blood and red human blood mixed together, and he felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Sarai trembled behind him untouched and unharmed. How? She whispered. How did you move so fast? Doyan looked down at his wounds that should have slowed him but did not. Humans are stubborn. He said simply. Word of what happened spread through the court like wildfire. The whispers changed from curiosity to something closer to fear. The human had killed 3 trained assassins while wounded and had shown no hesitation or mercy. Some called him dangerous. Others called him a monster. Queen Mathera called him to her private chambers that night. She sat alone in a room filled with shadows, and her ancient eyes studied him with new intensity. You know my son ordered those assassins, she said. It was not a question. Yes, Doyan replied. And yet you said nothing, she continued. You made no accusations and demanded no justice. Justice would require proof, Doyan said, and proof would require someone willing to speak against the heir. The queen smiled, and this time it held something that might have been respect. Clever human, she said softly. Perhaps you understand more than I realized. She rose from her chair and moved toward him with the fluid grace of a predator. I have plans for my daughter, she said, and those plans require a guardian who is loyal beyond manipulation and capable beyond expectation. What are you asking me to do? Diane asked. The queen stopped inches away, and her eyes locked with his. I am asking you to help me save my people, she said. Even if that means destroying my son. The weight of her words settled over him like a shroud. He thought of Sarai trembling behind him in the forest. He thought of her accepting her own murder as inevitable. He thought of what it meant to be human in a galaxy full of species who had forgotten how to care about anything beyond their own survival. Tell me everything, he said. Diane woke to the sound of machines humming in frequencies that felt wrong against his ears. The ceiling above him was curved and pale blue, and nothing about this place looked human. He tried to sit up, but pain flared through his shoulder and chest and forced him back down onto the medical beta. Voluntary physician appeared at his side within seconds. Alien was tall and thin, with skin that shimmered in shades of silver and green and eyes that studied Doyen like he was a fascinating specimen. Rather than a patient, you should not move, the physician said in careful comment. Your wound was severe, and human biology is strange to us. How long? Diane managed to ask through dry lips. 3 rotations of the station. The physician answered, your body fights to heal itself with aggression we have never witnessed before. 3 days unconscious, and he was already trying to get up. Physician made a note on a floating display and shook his head in what might have been disbelief. Your species confuses us, he admitted. The damage should have killed you, and yet your cells refuse to accept death. Doyen did not have an answer for that. Humans had always been stubborn about dying. The physician left to consult with colleagues, and Doyen lay alone in the alien medical bay and tried to remember exactly what had happened. The reception and the assassin and the blade cutting through his flesh, the princess kneeling in his blood with wonder in her eyes. He had saved her life without thinking, and now he was stuck in a voluntary medical facility far from anything familiar. The door to his room slid open and Princess Sarai walked in. She wore simpler robes today in shades of soft violet, and her iridescent skin seemed to glow faintly in the blue light of the medical bay. She stopped a few feet from his bed and looked at him with an expression he could not read. "You are awake," she said quietly. "Seems that way," Diane replied. She moved closer and sat in a chair beside his bed that had clearly been placed there for her previous visits. He wondered how many times she had come while he was unconscious. "I do not understand why you did what you did," she said. "You had no obligation to protect me, and you nearly died." Doyen thought about how to answer. The truth was simple, but he suspected she would not believe it. "I saw someone in danger," he said. "I acted." "But why?" she pressed. "You did. Not knowing me and saving my life brought you no advantage and could have cost you everything." This was the part that seemed to confuse every alien species humanity encountered. They could not understand actions taken without calculation of benefit, because it was the right thing to do. Diane Sarai stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. "Among my people, such an act creates a debt that cannot be ignored," she said carefully. "You spilled your blood to protect royal lineage, and that blood was red. I noticed." Diane said dryly. "You do not understand," she said and leaned forward. "Red is sacred to us, and we have never seen it flow from a living being before humans came to the stars." She held up her hands, and Diane saw that faint traces of reddish stain still marked her pale fingers. "I held your sacred blood in my hands," she said. "I felt your life pouring out to save mine, and that creates bonds that my people cannot break." Doyen was starting to realize that he had stumbled into something far more complicated than a simple rescue. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked. Before Sarai could answer, the door opened again, and Commander Cho walked in with tension written across her face. "Sergeant Park," she said with obvious relief. "Good to see you conscious." "Commander," he replied. "What is the situation?" Cho glanced at the princess and hesitated before speaking. The assassin belonged to an internal voluntary faction, she said. "Civil conflict is brewing within the sovereignty, and the Union wants all human personnel extracted immediately." "That seems reasonable," Diane said. "There is a complication," Cho continued, and her eyes moved to Sarai again. "The Queen has requested your presence before any extraction can occur." The princess stood from her chair and faced the commander with sudden steel in her posture. "My mother has invoked the right of sacred debt," she said. "The human cannot leave until the obligation is addressed." Cho's expression tightened. "We have no intention of getting involved in voluntary internal politics," she said firmly. "You are already involved," Sarai replied. "The moment his blood touched our floor, he became part of something larger than your intentions." Diane watched the exchange and felt the weight of forces moving around him that he did not understand. He was a soldier, not a diplomat, and palace intrigue was far outside his training. "What does the Queen want?" he asked. Both women turned to look at him. "That is something she will tell you herself," Sarai said. 2 hours later, Diane stood in the throne room of the voluntary royal flagship with bandages still wrapped around his chest and shoulder. The room was vast and dark, with columns of polished stone that rose toward a ceiling lost in shadow. At the far end, Queen Mathira Talvaneth sat upon a throne that seemed grown from crystal rather than built. She was ancient by any standard, with skin that had faded to pale silver and eyes that held the weight of centuries. Beside her stood a tall voluntary male with robes of midnight black and a face that radiated suspicion. "Hi." Custodian Urith studied Doyen like he was examining something unpleasant. Stuck to his shoe. Approach. The queen commanded. Her voice was soft, but carried through the chamber like it was whispered directly into his ear. Doyen walked forward and stopped at a respectful distance from the throne. He had no idea what protocols applied here, so he simply stood at attention like he would before any superior officer. You saved my daughter. The queen said it was not a question. Yes. Diane replied. Why? The same question Sarai had asked, and Diane gave the same answer. I saw a threat and I responded. He said, the princess was in danger and I acted to protect her. You expected no reward. The queen said, no political advantage and no leverage over my house. I expected nothing. Diane confirmed. I was doing my job. Silence filled the throne room. High custodian Yorith leaned close to whisper something to the queen, but she raised a hand to silence him. Every species in this galaxy would use such a debt to advance their position. She said slowly, they would demand favors and concessions and power in exchange for what you did. I am not every species. Diane said. The queen smiled, and it was the same cold smile she had worn alone in her chambers 3 days ago. No, she agreed. You are not. She rose from her throne and descended the steps toward him with movements that seemed too fluid for her apparent age. The debt must be honored, she declared. You spilled sacred blood to protect my lineage, and I will not allow that. Obligation to go unanswered. Diane felt his stomach tighten. What are you asking? He said, I am not asking. The queen replied and stopped directly in front of him. I am telling you that you will remain here as my daughter's sworn guardian until I decide the debt is paid. He opened his mouth to protest, but her eyes stopped. There was something in that gaze that spoke of plans within plans and machinations spanning decades. He was a piece on a game board he could not see, and the queen had just made her opening move. Sergeant Doyen Park stood near the eastern wall of the grand reception hall and watched the crowd with careful eyes. The Valentari diplomatic station orbited a neutral moon far from Earth, and everything about it screamed alien elegance that made humans feel small. And primitive tall beings with skin that shimmered like oil on water moved through the space in flowing robes of silver and deep blue. Their faces were angular and beautiful in a way that felt cold, and their eyes held the confidence of a species that had ruled the stars for 10,000 years. Doyen was not impressed. He had seen, too, many species who thought themselves superior to humanity, and he had learned that pride meant nothing when blood started spilling. His job tonight was simple: stand guard and watch for threats. While diplomats from the Galactic Commerce Union signed trade agreements with the Valentari sovereignty, he wore the standard black uniform of a human security contractor and carried a plasma pistol at his hip that he hoped he would not need to use. Commander Hai-Jin Cho stood 20 meters away near the main entrance, and she caught his eye with a subtle nod. Everything seemed calm. The reception celebrated renewed trade relations, and everyone pretended to be friends while hiding knives behind their smiles. Doyen understood politics well enough to know that every smile in this room was a weapon. He scanned the crowd again, and his gaze settled on a young Valentari female standing near the refreshment tables. She was smaller than the others, and her iridescent skin carried softer hues of purple and silver. Name was Princess Sarai Telvaneth, and she was the third daughter of the Valentari queen. Doyen had memorized the profiles of every important figure who would attend tonight. The princess was considered politically insignificant, according to the briefing documents. Third in line meant nothing in Valentari succession, and she held no real power. She stood alone while other nobles gathered in clusters and whispered behind elegant hands. Doyen noticed that no one spoke to her, and no guards stood close enough to matter. That bothered him for reasons he could not explain. A serving attendant moved through the crowd carrying a tray of crystal glasses filled with something that glowed faint blue. Doyen watched him without knowing why. His instincts had locked onto this particular servant. The attendant was Valentari, like the others, but something was Wrong his movements. Carried purpose that did not match his role. Servants flowed around obstacles like water, but this one moved like a predator, choosing the perfect angle of attack. Doyen pushed off the wall and started walking. The attendant set down his tray on a nearby table and his hand slipped inside his robe. Doyen walked faster. Princess Sarai stood with her back to the approaching threat, and she had no idea that death was coming for her. Attendant pulled something from his robe, and light caught the edge of a molecular blade that could cut through bone like paper. Doyen ran. He did not think about politics or consequences, or the fact that this was not his assignment. He saw a young woman about to die, and his body moved before his mind could catch up. The assassin raised his blade, and Doyen slammed into the princess from the side. He wrapped his arms around her and twisted his body to shield her. As the blade came down, fire exploded across his shoulder and chest as the molecular edge sliced through his uniform and into his flesh. The pain was immense, but Doyen had trained himself to work through pain. He shoved the princess away from danger and turned to face the assassin. The voluntary attacker seemed shocked that anyone had intervened. That moment of surprise cost him everything. Doyen grabbed the hand holding the blade and twisted. Hard bones cracked, and the assassin screamed as his wrist shattered under the pressure of human grip strength that exceeded what most species expected. Blade clattered to the floor, and Doyen drove his elbow into the attacker's throat. Assassin went down choking, and gasping. Doyen stood over him for 2 seconds before his legs gave out and he collapsed to his knees. Blood poured from the wound in his shoulder and chest and spread across the white floor in a growing pool of red. The reception hall erupted into chaos. Volthari nobles screamed and scattered, while guards finally rushed forward with weapons drawn. They were too late, and Doyen felt bitter amusement at their failure. Commander Cho was shouting orders somewhere behind him, but her voice sounded far away. Doyen looked down at his hands covered in his own blood and wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Then he saw Princess Sarai. She had not run like the others. She knelt beside him on the bloody floor, without any concern for her expensive robes, and her hands pressed against his wound in a desperate attempt to slow the bleeding. Her eyes were wide with something that looked like fear and gratitude and confusion all mixed together. "Why did you do that?" she asked in accented common that carried the musical tone of her species. Doyen tried to answer, but words would not come. His vision was going dark at the edges, and he could feel his heartbeat slowing as blood continued to pour from his body. Last thing he saw before unconsciousness took him was the princess staring at her hands covered in his red blood. Her expression was one of absolute wonder. He did not understand why until much later. Among the Voluntari, the color red was sacred. Their own blood ran violet like twilight skies, and they had never seen the crimson shade that humans carried in their veins. The princess knelt in a pool of sacred color and held the life of a human in her hands. That moment would change everything. Voluntary guards finally pulled the princess away, and medical teams rushed to stabilize Doyen before he could bleed out completely. Commander Cho fought through the crowd to reach her fallen soldier, and her face was pale with worry. The assassin was dragged away for interrogation, and nobles whispered behind their hands about what they had witnessed. A human had thrown himself in front of a blade meant for royalty. A human had done what voluntary guards had failed to do. A human lay dying on their floor because he had chosen to protect someone he did not know. The whispers spread through the station like fire, and by morning, the entire sovereignty would know what had happened. Queen Mathira Telvaneth received word of the attack within minutes. She sat alone in her private chambers aboard the royal flagship and listened to the report with a face that revealed nothing. Her third daughter was alive because of a human security contractor. The queen dismissed her messenger and sat in silence for a long time. Then she smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone whose gamble had paid off better than expected. She had set events in motion months ago, and now the pieces were falling into place. the human would survive she would make. Certain of that, and then she would collect what he owed her, whether he understood the debt or not.